in Kusama's own world. She, from a very early age, had strong visual experiences. I suppose possibly symptoms of psychological distress and anxiety, the kind of feeling one might have from a kind of panic disorder, where her vision is kind of crowded with dots or blurred. And all her life, Kusama has been striving through different works of art to create a kind of similar sensation in you, the viewer. Yayoi Kusama is one of the most famous artists in the world today, and Tate Modern did a major show of her work in 2012, which explored her long and fascinating career, and this is just an opportunity to return to her work through the lens of her great infinity mirror rooms and give another generation of audiences a chance to encounter her work, possibly for the first time in the flesh.
We wanted to open the exhibition with some context about who Kusama is and a little insight into the life she's led to this point. Kusama, who's an artist now in her 90s, was born in the interwar period in Japan. And the first images really convey that kind of middle class, the relatively wealthy upbringing that she was born into, but also the very conservative values. She always railed against the expectations of her family. I think there was a degree to which they expected her to become a homemaker, to be pretty subservient. So Kusama declared her ambitions to be an artist, to be a creative at a very young age. And her family were very openly against this. And there's a story in which Kusama describes her family sending her to a type of finishing school where she was expected to cultivate manners, and actually she went to study art instead. So I think that already gives us a sense of how rebellious, how defiant of her family's expectations Kusama was.
The display then traces her departure from Japan, fired by ambition and the need to cut free from this very restrictive conservative milieu. Images show how she hit the ground running in New York, first as a painter of considerable ambition, these huge white net paintings, and then really within months and a very few years, radicalizing her practice as a performance artist, a maker of installations, a maker of sculpture, and then her eventual return to Japan and the absence of work. She had a breakdown, she withdrew from the world, but then she began to engage once again in the 80s and 90s, and then really quite swiftly gains this extraordinary global reputation. And the penultimate photograph, which is one of my favourites, is of Kusama raising her fists in front of a group of her recent paintings in the final room of her 2012 retrospective at Tate Modern. So the first work of art that you encounter is The Universe as Seen from the Stairway to Heaven. Kusama has great titles, and it's one of her peep show works, and she's been making versions of this work since the 1960s. It's a mirrored work, and the idea is you look through one of the circular apertures and you get a sense of a kind of immersion in Kusama's own world.
We really like the idea that even though we're showing these large infinity mirror room installations, actually this is a concept that Kusama has deployed on a much smaller scale. But looking inside, you wouldn't necessarily know that because the space just seems to go on forever.
So we open the door on a very dark space. We seem to be looking at dozens, maybe hundreds, thousands of twinkling lights at kind of head height. And then as we move into the space, we look down into sort of deep, infinite space. It's a really strange feeling of vertigo, looking down, down, down. But then you look up and you look again into infinite space, sort of feels like corridors of blackness taking you to goodness knows where. And it's a very kind of out-of-body experience. And then suddenly you're plunged into darkness.
I first saw the cases for Kusama at the install, so they were brought up to the gallery spaces ready for the install, and that's the first time I saw them in real life. So you have pieces of the puzzle, and slowly as you're installing it, you're kind of putting it all together and understanding how it all fits together. The way they've designed it is so clever, how everything slots together so neatly. The process of putting the chandelier in had to be very carefully considered. 4 of the glass panels are put in before the chandelier is put into the centre of the chamber. And so it had to be done very carefully to manage that and make sure there was no damage. That was definitely the tensest point of the install.
Walking Piece is a slide projection that presents documentary photographs of Kusama walking alone in the streets of New York City. She is dressed in kimono and she is carrying a parasol that has appliqued to it these artificial flowers. And it's quite an extraordinary sight. And it's been said that this performance expressed Kusama's feelings of alienation, not least of being in a big city, but also being a woman artist of Japanese descent in an art world that was mainly dominated by white men. In the 1960s, in the post-war period, in which the United States and Japan had been on opposing sides in the war, I think that the propaganda and the messaging from governments had a very, very real and material effect upon people. I think Kusama certainly experienced this. Strangely enough, this seems to echo a moment of discrimination in the United States. It has been widely reported about attacks on people of East Asian descent in today's news media. So I think that this artwork is a very stark reminder of how history does seem to repeat itself.
She's really trying to replicate or translate as closely as possible experiences that have been very profound to her, and she wants them to be very profound to you. She's always put herself at centre stage, and this is a work in which she wants you to be centre stage. It's beautifully made, but again, it's a very simple technology. They're little LED lights, and they're connected via circuitry that creates an infinitely changing sequence of lights. The room is very dark, and there is a walkway on the floor, but either side of the walkway, there is just a thin layer of water. So it creates this strange, shimmering feeling. You're taken from your sense of security to a slight sense of anxiety. And what is very powerful about this work is that you really do feel part of an infinite, never-ending, boundless experience of colour and light. And it's very easy to lose your connectivity with the meeting you were just at or the people you're with. You're plunged into the kind of epicenter of her universe.
We were really keen not to pathologize Kusama's experience of mental illness. And to this end, we really scrutinized the extended captions around the artworks. Any mention of mental health we thought about very carefully. And we were also incredibly lucky to have had the consultation support of Rethink Mental Illness, which is a mental health charity in the UK. So in this way, we hope that we are communicating some of the experiences and issues around mental health appropriately in this exhibition.
You have to know, she arrived in New York at the end of the 1950s, and she was there for that decade where art became radical. She was a friend of Warhol, of Oldenburg's, of Donald Judd. She went from being a painter to being a performance artist. She went from being interested in literature to being interested in politics. She was part of kind of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll era. She went from painting canvases to painting bodies, from designing clothes to taking them off. And the mirror rooms at that time featured almost as a stage set. And she hired photographers. She documented every aspect of her career from her teenage years through to her 90s. And this is an extraordinary selection of photographs showing how Kusama collaborated with photographers of her generation, here notably Harry Shunk and Janos Kenda, and the renowned Japanese photographer Eko Hosoe. Now, this is a short archival film made by John Jones, who was an artist, filmmaker and lecturer, who documented dozens of artist studios in New York in the 1960s. And it gives a fascinating insight into her working life. And she poses. It's not a studio visit. It's a record of performative actions in her studio with her works. It's if the works themselves become props in Kusama's own fictionalization of her life. It's cheeky. It's very funny. But you see the interest, the engagement with sex, sexual liberation, her obsession with penises, her obsession with food. And these were part of her kind of psychological drama. And yet she is able to make them very funny and create space for you. I think Kusama had a lot of real pleasure and deep engagement, but it was a very, very tough time and it took its toll. She was very much on her own. She was derided as an Asian woman, an artist of colour, in a very white male world. I mean, she was indomitable, but it can't have been easy. And I think one of the reasons that her work became more radical was that she found her more conventional work was not accepted in the way it would have been had she been a male artist. So it was in kind of defiance of that her work got more and more radical. And then she gained this reputation for notoriety. I mean, she was undoubtedly a pioneer when you think about the way younger artists now routinely work in a number of different mediums at the same time. It was very, very unusual in the 60s for an artist to have a studio practice and work as a performance artist. And Kusama did everything. She defied the barriers between media, the boundaries between public and private, between commerce and the studio. She was her own dealer, she was her own publicist. She performed all those roles, and possibly of necessity, but also because she was unbelievably ambitious right from the start. Talk about, achieving against the odds.